everybody. Welcome to this very first filmed version of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. As the title of this episode suggests, I'm going to be talking about something quite difficult, and is actually quite timely. Not only because today is the anniversary of the beginning of the Sabra Shatila massacre, but also because we are 11 months into an ongoing genocide in Gaza, and an acceleration of the fascistic and expansionist project of Zionism. And so I'm going to be talking about the Sabra Shatila massacre of 1982, its causes, its effects, and its remaining relevance to the current situation. Before I get into it though, I want to issue another apology like I did for the last episode, because yet again, I neglected to make an episode last week, and there I have a much better reason. I was in Beirut. I don't know if I'd mentioned in the last episode, but I kind of spontaneously decided to go back home for a week. My cousin was getting married, but also it's been a year, and I miss it. And I've got a lot of stories to share, which I will do in a future episode, maybe next week. But for now, I want to talk about this anniversary, the massacre, and more relevant things. Not just my trip and my exploits. The one that I will definitely do a whole episode on is I went to see Edward Said's grave while I was there. Because I did recently discover that he's buried in Lebanon, in Brumeno. And that's a whole story and a half. So stay tuned. But before I get into the main topic of today's episode, here are some brief headlines. As you can see, I'm wearing a jacket because for the last 2 days, there's been quite an intense storm here in Central Europe, and it's caused massive amounts of flooding. The sort of drainage canal of the Danube, which is usually quite low-lying, is kind of overflooded, and it's pretty scary shit, and just another sign that climate change, that climate collapse is here, and we need to take it more seriously, and not just focus on prevention, but adaptation. And I don't know, it's really scary, but also it's what we've been predicting for decades. And aside from that, since I won't be talking that much about Gaza in this episode, there has been no let-up in the bombardment and the genocide in Gaza. The Israelis committed several massacres in the last few days, most notably this tent massacre, yet another tent massacre, in what is described as a humanitarian zone in El Mawasi. And there's this huge crater, 9 meters deep into the sand, and around it it's all just tents. And again, as we've been seeing for the last months, with absolutely no reaction from the so-called international community. Quite the opposite. They are still cheering it on. They're still saying Israel has a right to defend itself. They're still saying this is Hamas's problem and Hamas's fault. And it's disgusting genocide denial that's just completely normalized. Not just denial, supporting. Yesterday I arrived from Beirut and had an incredibly disgusting experience in passport control. Because at the exact same time I arrived, a plane from Tel Aviv arrived at the exact same time. So I was surrounded by Israelis in passport control. And I saw one guy, one border police, just every single person presenting an Israeli passport, he would literally give them these thumbs up. And I overheard him. I really tried hard to hear what he was saying. But I heard him say, "We are with you. You are doing great." And them just being oh, thank you. Oh, fucking just disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. And left a really bitter taste in my mouth that's still there. And I think is going to result in another episode just on that topic. Because essentially, you want to do genocide, you want to support genocide as a white person, as literally the grandchildren of Nazis, then support Israel. If you want to beat up black and brown people, then join the police force. It's honestly so fucked up. The normalization of violence against these marginalized bodies. My whole last episode is about this, where I talk about, against hate. It's just a really silly liberal framework to sort of attempt to combat fascism, but I don't know. The center is becoming so right-wing There are elections now in Austria, and it seems like the far-right Freedom Party is going to make a landslide victory. And funny enough, for Austria, this would be the second time that it has a government with the FPÖ. The first time in 2001, which resulted, I think, in sanctions against the state of Austria. And now it's obviously very different because the fascists are in power in Italy. The center government in Germany is becoming increasingly fascist, and over there as well, the AfD are making gains. And yeah, there's just far-right politics everywhere. And the center is doing what it's always done, which is appealing more to the right because they're afraid of the left. Because in order to appease or give in to the left, they have to actually make some serious changes. We're also seeing this in the US, with Kamala Harris sort of doubling down on her support of this genocide, but also on border violence, on so many other things, as a way of appealing to the right, as opposed to actually doing anything to get a ceasefire, or to, arms embargo against the state of Israel, which are the demands of so many people who are saying they will withhold their vote. And so, come November, if Kamala Harris loses, it's her own damn fault. So, today I'm going to be talking about the Shatila massacre that happened on September 16 to September 18, 1982. I'm going to give a brief overview. I'm going to talk about the thing itself, although I'll try to avoid the more graphic details. I'll also provide a link in the bio, which is from an Al Jazeera documentary that came out a couple of decades ago that really thoroughly goes through the Shatila massacre and relies heavily on the testimony of survivors. It's honestly a very difficult watch, but it's really important. And talking about this amidst a current genocide on continuous occupation of Palestinians by Zionist forces with the support of Western imperialist powers, it's very difficult. But I think it is yet again another one of those things wherein the history kind of reveals a lot about the current moment. The cyclical nature, the fact that it's the exact same Israeli Zionist state that supported this massacre, facilitated, let's say, the Sabra Shatila massacre, that is now committing just horrendously similar massacres today. So, I'm going to give a very brief overview of the lead-up to the 1982 Israeli siege of Beirut, and then the subsequent Sabra Shatila massacre, which was committed by Christian fascist militias in Lebanon, with the support of the Israelis who were at the time besieging Beirut. This is all in the context of the Lebanese civil wars. I say civil wars because it was not one war. It lasted for 15 years and involved not just local parties and local factions and militias, but also regional and international. And honestly, it's something that is so obfuscated for many reasons. In large part because the militias that fought this war, the warlords that came from it, the parties that formed during the war, are still very much in power. And so quite literally, no Lebanese person is taught this history in school. They can't agree on a curriculum, because in order to agree on a curriculum, some things have to be, made objective. What is the history they all agree on? And so you talk to 10 Lebanese people, they'll give you 15 different accounts. And obviously falling on party lines, on sectarian lines. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you today is my attempt to cut through a lot of the sectarian bullshit and share with you some of the things that I have learned over the last few years through my own personal research, through my watchings, through my readings, and through my conversations. I emphasize this just to suggest that what you're going to hear is quite, I don't want to say unique because it feels like I'm sort of, bloating my ego a bit, but it's definitely something that has elated or kind of evades us, even us, because this history is quite still present and still raw in many ways. So, In 19... But also because this history is so connected to the Nakba, to Zionism, and to Western imperialism. And that kind of narrative is often ignored and, erased, essentially, because of this desire to just sort of move on. The war ended simply because it ended. There was no real resolution to any of the core issues. And it's kind of scary to read why the war started and what the demands are of the people who essentially kind of started the war, because those same demands exist today. The structural issues still exist. To the many people who were victims of these structures that, again, still exist. And again, I will focus a lot on the Sabra Shatila massacre, the existence of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and the remaining existence of not just the Israeli state, but also of these fascist Christian militias, who are on the rise once again in the form of these ridiculous, fucked up things like Shnuder Rab and whatever. So, let's start very briefly with the end of the First World War, because in many ways, a lot of these problems kind of have roots in that era. After the First World War, with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and its collapse, Western imperialist powers divided up the Middle East and essentially created the Middle East. This was done through a series of agreements, treaties, the League of Nations, and what was called the Mandate System. The mandates, to me, were a form of colonialism. To them, as they packaged it, they were coming into these nascent nation states and essentially helping them form to become states. This was in clear, violation of trust of the Arabs who supported the French and the British in defeating the Ottomans with the promise in support of their national demands. Instead, complete betrayal. If anyone's seen Lawrence of Arabia, this is the plot of the film, of the story, which is, after the war, completely betrayed Arab trust, and we're like, actually, no, we're not going to let you become your own, states and your own whatever. Instead, we are going to take over and help you. Obviously, with many caveats. At the same time, this is the same time as the Balfour Declaration, wherein the British, who had now gained control of Palestine, had agreed to create a national home for the Jews for the European Zionists. Lebanon, for its part, was colonized or put under the mandate of the French. And I emphasize this a lot because these borders that we have today were drawn in this period. They are not historical borders. For decades, centuries, there's this idea of Mount Lebanon. There's a sort of cosmopolitanism to cities like Beirut, Damascus, Aleppo, Jerusalem. But there is not this is Lebanon and this is Syria. The best example of this is Jordan. Whenever you see straight lines, shit's fucked. And so, with these colonial borders, the French and the British begin to cement certain ideas that these are, alongside, I should say, the nationalist bourgeoisie of each respected area, in collaboration with these elites. And so Lebanon gains independence from the French in 1944, and for the Palestinians, they experienced the Nakba only 4 years after, in 1948. And hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are driven out of Palestine. Many flee to Jordan, many to Lebanon. And almost immediately begin working to return. But more specifically, in 1964, in what is described as the Palestinian Revolution. This is really important because I've noticed it doesn't really exist in English. I hear it described a lot in Arabic, the Palestinian Revolution. But when I Google it, I don't know. And what it essentially describes is the Palestinian organizing through Fatah and the PLO, and is the first major attempt for Palestinians to organize in the diaspora, or rather in exile, to, them themselves pick up arms and liberate themselves. And they do so from bases in Jordan and in Lebanon, the places where they mostly are. And what ends up happening a lot throughout the 60s, especially the late 60s, is that Palestinian militants use those bases of operation, essentially, from Jordan, from Lebanon, to attack the Zionist state and to, do operations. This causes a lot of tension with specifically the Jordanian state, later on the Lebanese state. I will get to that in a second. But it's important to start with the Jordanian state because the Jordanian state is Zionist as fuck. They signed agreements with the Zionists, I think, starting in the 30s. There was always this tacit agreement that you'll have this part, we'll have this part. And King Abdullah is pure collaboration. And pure collaboration with the British. I think at the time, the head of the Jordanian army was a British guy. And it's part of the reason why in 1948, the only real army that could have posed a serious threat to the Zionists, as in the Jordanian army, did not fight. Very, very little. They could have made a difference, but all they did was fight up until essentially what are the borders of the West Bank today. Proceeded to occupy the West Bank themselves until 1967, and yeah. So these border fightings, these operations from Jordan, caused a lot of tension with the Jordanian monarchy, the Jordanian Zionist monarchy, and led to essentially Black September, wherein the Jordanian monarchy, I think in 70 or 71, kicked out the PLO. And there was a sort of a war between the Jordanian state, essentially, doing a kind of Zionism or like fighting on behalf of the Zionists, and kicked out the PLO. Some people describe it as a civil war. It was not a civil war. If you've seen this very famous interview with Hassan Kanafani, he pushes back on this point a lot. This is a monarchy fighting on behalf of a settler colonial state against resistance factions of national liberation. So a lot of these Palestinians, amongst them refugees, amongst them armed factions and political parties, flee to Lebanon and continue their operations from there, which creates similar tensions with the Lebanese state. And these fightings, these attacks lead to, the Israelis responding, bombing refugee camps, bombing areas in the south, and creates tension with the Lebanese army. This all results in a treaty in Cairo in, I think, 1969. And there's a sort of tacit agreement. The Lebanese state claims they don't want to get dragged into this conflict. But the way I see this history is that it is our conflict. That so much of this problem is rooted in the 1948 Nakba, in the advent of Zionism, and Western imperialist interest in essentially controlling this region. And they don't just do this through Zionism. They do this also by the establishment and with collaboration with these nation states, with the local elite. It's very hard to describe this actually in one episode, and I don't want to try to do a full history of the Levant in what is probably going to end up being like a 30-minute episode. But essentially the way I see it is that by their dispossession and by their constant demand to, resist occupation and settler colonialism and their situation as stateless people, the Palestinians are constantly defying not just the Zionist state and not just Western imperialism, but also the nation-state formation within this region. Because as stateless people, as people with a demand for national liberation that conflicts, again, not only with Zionism, but also with some of these nationalisms. And so there's this constant tension between Palestinian militants and Arab, bourgeois, liberal, whatever leaders. And a lot of this comes to a head in 1975. Between the Palestinian Revolution and the beginning of the civil war in Lebanon in 1975, the Palestinian militants and political parties, most notably the PLO, form partnerships or ally themselves with what is called the Lebanese National Movement, alongside the Communist Party, and essentially the demands are very similar, because the Lebanese National Movement, whose most notable leader was Kamal Jumblatt, who is so radically different from his son, Walid Jumblatt, because he actually kind of stood for something, their demands were also the sort of dissolution of the sectarian oligarchical system. And they supported the Palestinian struggle quite intensely because they saw the Lebanese bourgeoisie, the Lebanese state, as being complicit with Zionism and with Western imperialism. And so essentially their demands, which I think were fully formulated in 1974, is honestly really scary to read. This is what I was referring to earlier. Because I remember I was reading about it in 2019 during the Lebanese October 17 revolution, and it's just word for word some of the same demands we had at the time. Making Lebanon a single electoral whatever. So now it's kind of, no, I'm not going to get into Lebanese electoral systems because it's fucked and it's unbelievably difficult to understand, let alone explain. But essentially, the Lebanese National Movement were allies with the PLO and essentially had certain demands of desectarianization, of, I don't know, kind of a social political revolution. And they were doing this in opposition to the sectarian parties, to sectarianism itself, which was defended quite heavily by the main benefactors of sectarianism, i.e. Maronite Christian political parties, most notably Kataib, or the Phalange, quite literally named after Spanish fascists, and the Lebanese Forces, which came from it afterwards, but essentially the Maronites. Essentially Maronite elites. I make a very important point to avoid sectarian language, because sectarianism is not the de facto thing that just actually exists, and so political parties form on its basis, but rather the political parties essentially create the sectarianism. And the way Marxist Lebanese historian Fawaz Trabulsi describes this period, the early 70s, is fascinating. Because what he says is if there wasn't a civil war in Lebanon, there would have been a revolution. And there were so many actions, so many strikes, so many protests, so many just mobilizations at so many different levels that was really challenging the status quo. And in many ways, the choice to do a civil war, the choice to commit massacres, to just, it's a choice. Again, I say this because there's so much language of spiraling into civil war, and I reject this completely. It was a choice by political parties to protect their own hegemony, specifically the far-right Christian militias, or rather political parties. They form their real militias later. So, this is 1975. I need to get up to 1982. There is an incredible amount of stuff that happens. But most importantly for this, in 1978, Israel invades southern Lebanon and creates what they're now talking about once again, creating a buffer zone. They want to go up to the Litani River, which many Zionists claim is the actual natural borders of the state of Israel. And there's a lot of little bits. I think the Israelis claim that 78 bullshit, you know what I mean? There's this sort of like, oh, we need to do this because there was this attack, and I'm sure a lot of people will be in the comments of this video of like, wow, how convenient that you're neglecting this one attack or this one operation that necessitated the killing of thousands of Lebanese people and Palestinians and the occupation of southern Lebanon, which would last for another 22 years. I don't care. But it's important to say that 78, Israel had already invaded. People ignore this when they talk about 82, because 82 was like a full invasion, but it had already started 4 years earlier. So, as I said, there are essentially two main groups in this period of the Lebanese civil wars. And again, it gets much more complicated in the 80s. But at this point, there is still kind of the Christian sectarian right and the left alliance known as the Lebanese National Movement alongside the Palestinian factions. And here's a really important note, because honestly, sometimes I talk a lot of shit about the Syrian regime, and I'm made to feel like I'm complicated things, or I'm in some way, I don't know, doing something unhelpful. But I think it's really important to note, just to be clear, just to know the history, just to understand what actually is happening. Because in 1976, the Christian right-wing parties, militia, besiege Tel el-Zatar, which was at the time one of the biggest refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut. They besieged it, and in it were not only thousands of Palestinian refugees, but also PLO fighters. And from the outside, they were not able to break the siege, but they were close to, and it was looking like the Christian right were losing. But they were saved by Hafiz al-Assad. This, I remember when I first discovered it, kind of broke my mind, because there's so much language, obviously, and so much posturing that the Assad regime supports Palestinian resistance, but they don't. Very specifically, Hafiz al-Assad hated Yasser Arafat, and there was a lot of antagonism between the two, and also, was deeply opposed to Kemal Jumblat and the Lebanese National Movement, because he wanted, that is, Hafiz al-Assad, to protect the Lebanese sectarian system, because they were kind of benefiting from it. And there's this kind of scary, what if it gets overthrown and changed, and what if, I don't know. But they do invade Lebanon in 1976 to defend Kataib against the Palestinians. Tel el-Zatar falls, the Palestinian militias surrender, and they commit a horrendous massacre. That is, the Christian right-wing militias. So, fast forward a bit. Or rather, let's go back to the original line, because that was the tangent. In 1982, Israel invades Lebanon beyond the Litani River and reach Beirut. For many accounts, on the invite of Kataib, specifically by Bashir Jmeil, who at the time was the highest-ranking member. I believe he was also the founder of the Lebanese Forces, not to be confused with the Lebanese Armed Forces, the latter being the army, and the former being one of the most disgusting militias that came to define the civil war. And they invaded Beirut. Beirut at the time was divided west and east, east being under the control of specifically Christian right-wing militias, and the west being under the control of this array of groups, including the LNM, including the PLO, including the Communist Party, and the SSNP, and so many others. And demographically also was full of Sunnis, Christians, Shia, Druze. There is definitely this difference of the heterogeneity of West Beirut and the sort of homogeneity of East Beirut. Anyway, they besiege West Beirut and bombard it. And their stated goal is to chase out the PLO. And it's this really disgusting thing when you understand the history, that not only did Zionist forces expel Palestinians in 1948 and again in 67, but continued to chase them deep into Lebanon. And there are a lot of parallels with the Israeli siege of Beirut in 82 with the current genocide in Gaza, obviously in a far different scale and with now much more advanced technology. But they cut off water, they cut off electricity, they bombed indiscriminately, committed numerous massacres, used white phosphorus, bombed hospitals, and essentially they got what they wanted. I think a month into the invasion, a month into the siege, they did kick out the PLO. The PLO were driven out of Beirut, I think initially going to Tripoli, and then from Tripoli, I think in Tunis, sort of the PLO was headquartered there in Tunisia. And yeah, then while they're still there, the Israelis kind of elect Bashir Gemayel. Bashir Gemayel was elected as the president of Lebanon. It's important to note that since this period, since like the 70s, every president in Lebanon and kind of prime minister is elected on the back of tanks. Either, and mostly, Syrian tanks, or in this case, an Israeli tank. And this isn't just a metaphor. Especially during the war, quite literally, in order to make safe passage for parliamentarians to get to parliament, just physically, to vote, they have to be protected. And usually it was the Syrians that would protect this route. In this case, it was literally the Israeli tanks that made it possible for the parliamentarians to go, to vote, and to elect Bashir Gemayel, who, I should note, is not just a collaborator of the Zionists, but was a blood and soil fascist. His whole thing was Lebanon is 10,452 square kilometers, Lebanon first, Lebanon for the Lebanese, and he was just a mouth-gargling fascist, specifically against Palestinians, who he saw as a stain, as a cancer, essentially, that needs to be cut out. Horrible guy. Do not mourn his death at all. Quite the opposite. Quite happy that he is dead and rotted, and kind of despise the fact that there's still so much valorization of him and the project that he wanted to do, that his brother kind of did a little bit afterwards. But yeah, I don't know if I'd mentioned at the beginning, the reason that I wanted to do this episode is because today is the anniversary of Sabra Shatila, but also yesterday is the anniversary of his killing. Oh, kind of realized I jumped the gun, because I don't think I said that he was assassinated. But essentially he was elected, but before he could take office, he was assassinated by an explosive detonated by Habib Shartouni, who was a Lebanese man, part of the SSNP, the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party. And I know what you're thinking, Nationalist Socialist? That sounds fucked. It is. It used to be quite an array of different actors and different whatever. It is now just basically a really shitty, horrendous militia that kind of controls parts of Ras Beirut. But it's kind of one of the oldest political parties in Lebanon. And not everyone that was part of it was like a Nazi. I don't know. It's a very, very, very weird party. But now it is functionally a party of Nazis. Their flag is literally, it looks... Anyway, I say this because also my grandfather for a time was part of the SSNP. But I mean, whose grandfather wasn't, you know? But anyway, so regardless. So yeah, Bashir Gemayel was killed. And there's a really interesting part of this documentary I watched, again, which I will put in the description below, where the person who found his body was literally a Mossad agent. And there's sort of eyewitness accounts that this guy was digging through the dirt with his hands and yelling, "We have to find him," because he is their guy. Like, he's not just has Zionist adjacent beliefs, he is the Israelis guy. And I think his body was like airlifted to Haifa. I don't know. it's just very clear. It's not a kind of conspiracy thing of like he was kind of a Zionist. Like, no, he was a fucking like Israeli spy, essentially. And I'm glad he was killed before he could take power. And yeah, Habib Shartouni was a Lebanese man. I think he was captured, later fled to Syria. But the Israelis and the Christian right were so infuriated by this killing, by this assassination, that literally the very next day, before they even know who did it, they immediately blamed the Palestinians. And they commit one of the most notorious, if not the most notorious massacre of the Lebanese civil wars, which is the Sabra massacre. So Sabra and Shatila. I'm very used to saying it because in Arabic it's the woo, which is and. But anyway, so I'm going to keep saying it. I should have said this from the beginning, that when I say Sabra or Shatila, I'm saying Sabra and. Okay, I'm not excited about this part. But very quickly, the Israelis are already in Beirut. And they encircle the Sabra and Shatila camps, which is a very, very large Palestinian camp, which also includes many Lebanese, specifically Lebanese people of the Shia sect. It's quite a poor area. It's quite literally a refugee camp. And it still exists and is still an incredibly deprived area. Very dense, a lot of poverty. And anyway, so what happens over the next 2 or 3 days is that the Israelis besiege the camps and facilitate this massacre. They allow into the camps these barbaric groups, militias, the Tiger forces, the Lebanese forces, and the accounts of this massacre are unfathomable. And it lasted for 3 days. And we're talking about men going house to house, killing indiscriminately. Also, heavy use of sexual violence. And the Israelis quite literally shone lights so that they can continue the massacre overnight, would shoot flares so that the Lebanese forces could continue. And the massacre went on for at least 2.5 days. There are accounts that they slept there, that they brought mattresses. And honestly, it's vile. It is horrific in its meticulousness, but also in its just... Also, a lot of these people were high as fuck. Sorry. But literally would take things to get into this phase of just bloodlust. And they didn't need it anyway. They hated these people so much. They thought of them as subhuman. So, all the while, this is all physically being overseen by then Israeli Defense Minister, later Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon. And it's horrendous. I really don't know how to describe it. I'm seeing images because I know the details, but I don't want to share them. And I think if people have seen what's happening in Gaza, you are familiar with what the Israelis are capable of and what depraved, disgusting acts of violence they can commit that they deem permissible. And again, as I said in my video essay, almost necessary. Also, their collaborators, you know. So that is the Sabra Shatila massacre. I think approximated death toll at like 3,500 or so. And the reason it was able to happen at all is because the PLO had already been driven out. There was no one to defend the elderly, the women, the children. And the reason that this is so haunting, that this is so necessary to remember, and to note is because this is what the Israelis are going to do and what they are doing. But when they demand that Hamas lets down their weapons, the war will end when Hamas surrenders. The most vile, disgusting lie, which obviously it's a lie. We all know it's a lie. But quite specifically, when looking at the history like this, that it is precisely the moment that they are the most defenseless that the Israelis will go in and continue to commit massacres. Because many note that the Sabra Shatila massacre does constitute genocide, does constitute a genocidal act to eliminate the existence of these people who are already deprived, already stateless, already refugees from the Nakba, from 67, to eliminate them there and eliminate them totally. And that is the goal now in Gaza. And it's really fucked. But what's also fucked is the continued collaboration of the Lebanese state, of the Jordanian state, of the Egyptian state. Because this is the massacre that I remember so well watching in documentary films with women screaming, Wain al-Arab? Where are the Arabs? And that is a question I don't think is asked anymore, because I think it's pretty clear. And there are a lot more of the local bourgeoisie, of the political elite, who are very comfortable with Zionism, with capitalism, with Western imperialism, than they are with the resistance against these structures, be it from Palestinians or from their own fucking dissenters. And so the hauntings of Sabra Shatila are still there. And so, yeah, the immediate aftermath of this massacre is alongside the ongoing popular resistance against Israeli occupation. Beirut liberates itself, and the Israelis withdraw back down to the Litani River and continue occupying the south of Lebanon until again the south liberates itself in 2000, wherein the Israelis withdraw alongside their, again, other Christian fucking militias, Lebanese fascist collaborators. I hate this history so much, but it is so important to keep in mind because I think it's kind of a cyclical thing. These people are all still in power. These Christian militias are kind of on the rise again. They kind of became sort of irrelevant in the 90s and 2000s, much more so in the mid-2010s, but their power has definitely waned as a result of the civil war, their hegemony, let's say. And again, their main reason for fighting so intensely was to maintain their control over the state. And all that happened with the Ta'if agreement is not only that, half of Lebanon was occupied by the Israelis and the other half was occupied by the Syrians, who basically facilitated the continuation of the sectarian system with just like some minor changes in the power sharing, who gets how many seats and whatever. And so, yeah, that is a brief history of the Sabra Shatila massacre, in the context of the Lebanese civil wars, in the context of the ongoing Nakba. Don't forget, and I'm surprised I haven't said this before on this podcast, there is a very important term, which is not just the Nakba, but the al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing, the continuous Nakba, which we saw in Sabra Shatila, and we definitely see today in Gaza, where people are being displaced over and over and over again, and driven to exhaustion, and no one's doing anything about it. But yeah, I know for sure that that's an incomplete history. I know there are things that I've left out, things that I've forgotten, Definitely, if you also know this history, I definitely appreciate comments, reflections, anybody who wants to share something. This will be on YouTube. You can obviously listen to this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the other podcasts, but it seems like I'll be moving a bit more to YouTube in general, especially now with this video format. And yeah, apologies, of course, if I did forget something. I don't know why. It is very difficult for me to write these days, and so this was quite impromptu, or just me talking. And obviously, I'm pretty fucked up these days, so my mind isn't as clear as I wish it to be. But I hope you appreciate this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you're still out there and pushing for not just a ceasefire, but also an arms embargo, also isolating Israel, economically, but also at the fucking UN and whatever. But either way, that was another episode of Politically Depressed. The conclusion of the first video episode of Politically Depressed. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, you can support this podcast in a number of ways. You can become a member of our Patreon, links below, obviously. And through that, you get access to my exclusive podcast, Keep This Between Us, as well as a lot of other great content from the Media Collective. You can leave a tip in the tip jar below, or you can just leave a review or rating, like and subscribe now that I'm on YouTube. And yeah, or simply just tell your friends. So yeah, hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you all next time.